So there's Steve and Dee going around with a mic. Do we have any questions? Anastasia, of course. What? The front.
That's probably the moment when I say Anastasia and his wife, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to maybe combine a couple of presentations. Like we were talking about how to cross this chasm, yes, and to go to like basically B2B, and we were talking about the pricing, and that was mostly focused on like B2C. So how we do pricing in B2B models? Is it different from B2C business? Can you apply same concepts? Do you do the same personas? Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, definitely a good question. So a lot of the statistical methodologies you can use for both, basically because you're just collecting data. But I think to answer your question a little more directly, when you're looking at B2B versus B2C or just pricing in general, it's always a function of your customer. So depending on, if you're selling to a Fortune 500 company and it's a really long sales cycle and there's a lot of different factors, it's not going to be a $49 product, right? Even if, if that's where the willingness to pay comes back, then you have a bigger problem. So it's always going to be a function of your customer, and then it's also a function from your customer about what the sale process is going to look like. So if you're doing something touchlessly, you might have to give up some value that you could be getting because you're not putting a salesperson to really kind of hone in on that value in the purchasing process. So I'd really say, like, to not ramble too much, that it's always going to be a function of your customer, and then the biggest difference between B2B and B2C is just if you want to insert some friction there to overcome maybe some value divides that you have with a particular customer.
How do you do that in a SaaS product where you're pretty public about your pricing as opposed to enterprise software pricing, which has been opaque for the last couple of decades? But the new world of SaaS pricing, it's very straightforward, it's very public, transparent, easy, packaging, 1, 2, 3 prices, and that's it. How do you take that to almost individual pricing?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think the biggest mistake, there's a couple of big mistakes, but one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make with their pricing is that it's like a mono price mindset, like one price for every type of customer. Like we were talking about in a couple of the presentations, you want to align a lot of your business to these particular personas. So the way that you get around that and not having a custom price for every single customer is you can either do feature differentiation, so that's kind of the traditional like good, better, best type model. The better way to do it and kind of where we're seeing the market go, and it'll be kind of ubiquitous in the next couple of years, is using what's called a value metric. So a value metric is what you charge for. So it could be per user, it could be per 100 Facebook likes, it could be per whatever that actual unit of value is. And that helps you, quote, it sounds bad, but it's actually a good thing. It helps you price discriminate because you make sure you're not charging, Disney or the BBC the same price that you're charging, a small startup, which is probably the biggest problem that you'll see in a lot of early stage startups is that they end up charging kind of the same price or very, very close to the same price for very, very different types of customers who are getting very, very different points of value. The one other thing that we are seeing is actually if you're kind of a mid-market company or like a mid-market, mid-enterprise kind of company, not quite like a 9-month-long contract negotiations, but not quite a touchless sale, you're seeing a lot of people not necessarily take pricing off the page, but not really being fully transparent with pricing until there's a phone call. So you can kind of more customize your price to each individual customer. And normally there's some work that you need to do to make that really work, but that allows you to make sure that, again, you're not charging a small startup the same price you are to a Fortune 2000 company.
Obviously, we're talking about growth. A lot of it has to do with sales and marketing. And I mean, from the panel, I mean, how many have a marketing background? Okay. Do you see that there's a change of sort of what the education system is creating now from a marketing perspective? as to what it is. I mean, particularly looking at something like what Melvin is doing, where it's, he knows a background within marketing, and yet he's looking at it from a very different approach. Is the education system failing when it comes to marketing or growth?
It's a really interesting question, actually. I was asked or invited to be a trustee in the UK with one of the biggest marketing and advertising continuous professional development. It's like a professional qualification course. And I went along for the interview, and I was talking with them, and they were like, "Oh, what's growth hacking then?" And I was like, oh, "Okay, well," gave a brief overview, a description, and they said, and then you look at like behavioral economics and applied psychology and social herd movement, just some basic stuff. And they were like, "What's that then? Is that how do you put that in your plan?" And I was like, "Do you do any split testing or A/B testing or just something really simple like that?" "Oh yeah, well we do social media." I was like, "Oh boy, okay." And unfortunately, I was actually there, and I accidentally insulted one of the main ladies who was interviewing me, because she said, I said, "Come on, let's take social media as an example, right? And we all use it, right?" I said, anyone can just go on social media, on Twitter, follow people back, and you can get like several thousand Twitter followers just from doing that." And I said, that's not clever. That's not marketing. That's just like reciprocal links. And unfortunately, that was her main business that I was actually then insulting. I didn't actually go for it after that. I wasn't. They didn't invite me back. But I think there's a real problem with education in the traditional sense, in that the biggest problem they have is that to prove some of the stuff that we're having to do and test daily, they can't do that on a quantifiable way at the same pace. Because I mean, if you think about how quickly marketing has changed online within the last year, 6 months even, the same strategies and tactics won't work. They just don't work. And unfortunately, the traditional academic system is just geared towards that's the pace that things have to be assessed in an academic viewpoint. But the correlation to that to real business and real world, there's a massive disconnect. And I don't know how that bridge is going to happen.
Okay.
Yeah, the way I've seen it, or the conversations I've had with people that had experience in marketing or already graduated, it's always that issue that probably they weren't thought with that thing, like the tools we have today of in one day you can test 1,000 different ads and see which can react. So that wasn't available 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So it's very hard. Of course, universities move slower than technology, so it's very hard to change all the programs for that. So I've seen that this concept is actually that it's very hard to teach just because you've been, 5 years spent completely the opposite, and how do you discard everything you've been taught to try this completely different approach? But I think you need to understand that if people 20 years ago had this tool, they would have done it this way. It's not because the madman way is the best way. It's because that's the only way they could have done it. That's the tools they had is TV, and then they couldn't just try with £1 a test in one day and see what happened. That wasn't available. And embracing those tools and using them as something that goes on top of everything that you learn in marketing, it's actually powerful and not one or the other. It's grab what you know about marketing, all that knowledge you know about how launching a campaign, but try to apply it to the tools we have today. And I've seen that issue, like probably at least the experience I've had in the 2 years we've been with Leaf.
I think it's one of those things too, where if you notice in, I think all 4 of the presentations, none of them were like tactic based. And I think like even, acquiring versus, personas, I think a lot of marketing out there and like the common education, it's very arts and crafts, like tactics, like the path of least resistance is to, oh, I read this article on, 20 tests I can do with Facebook. I'm just going to go do those tests and as you just said, like most of the time, by the time that's published, the test won't work any longer because that, medium has been, already sucked up. And I think that there's the difference between like really good marketers out there and the actual growth folks, and then just like marketers who come out of school, I think typically is like a lack of laziness, and like not even like hardcore, lack of laziness, just like a minor amount of critical thinking, because in everything that you guys brought up in your presentations was all very, hey, well, we tested this didn't work, this allowed for this. Hey, you have to think through like deal structures, stuff like that. And I think that a lot of like that, you don't learn that in school like anywhere anymore. It's always very like rote, like this is what you should do. Here's A plus B equals C kind of stuff.
There's also one thing that I don't know if you've seen it, but I guess in my experience in architecture and design, it happens. It's also the ego that also don't allow you to want to test a lot of stuff. It's because you wanna be the one that came up with this amazing idea. So it feels good to think that you came with this very amazing concept that no one thought about, and you wouldn't want to do something ugly because you would think like you don't know how to design or create a good campaign, even though that might be the best way. But it will look better for you to do something very amazing, even if it is not the most effective one. So I think that also maybe when you don't come with that. Because like it also happens in architecture, so when people that design and don't come from that background don't care about doing stuff and maybe some is more effective, but when you come with that background, it's that you feel the pressure, you have to do it well. And sometimes that's also could be a barrier. I think so.
I think actually, just picking up on Patrick's point as well, there was, the schooling system is very much right or wrong. And if you're good in tech on what you're doing, there's no such thing as right or wrong, just what works. One thing might work for one person, it won't work for another person, it might work in one sector, it won't work in another sector. So in schooling system where you've got a very linear, ones and zeros, right or wrong, in reality, that doesn't exist. And that line is blurred so much, but how do you test that? How do you give someone an A? If they're saying something completely counter to what the teacher's saying.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think it's been a long day for everyone. Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks.